We have two interviews on conversations. The first is with Kevin Phillips discussing his recent book, Wealth and Poverty. That will be followed by an interview with Dr. Benjamin Friedman of Harvard University, who has the author of Day of Reckoning, which was taped at an earlier date. Thank you very much. Good evening. Good evening and welcome very, very much to Conversations, where we're very pleased and honored to welcome to the program Kevin Phillips. And we're talking with Mr. Phillips here, where he's given an address to BENS, the Business Executives for National Security, and also talking about his incredibly new, interesting new book, The Politics of Rich and Poor. And Kevin Phillips, welcome very, very much to Conversations.
Pleasure.
You had written the book, of course, it was a hallmark, and so many people in setting up the tone of the 1980s, the emerging Republican majority. This book seems to have changed. It could have been written, possibly, some people have suggested, the emerging Democratic majority. It isn't, obviously, but maybe you could talk a little bit about what you wanted to, the tone you wanted to try and set with this new book that emphasizes wealth and so forth.
Well, my sense is that there is some continuity between the two books. The first, The Emerging Republican Majority, goes back to the 60s, talking about the early stages of the Republican coalition. And this one, which I started in 1987, focuses on really what are the advanced dynamics of the Republican National Coalition and the extent to which they're doing what the Republicans have done before, which is producing a very significant concentration of wealth right at the top. And that we have seen, to some extent, an upward redistribution of money. We've seen some new wealth created, but we've seen wealth also redistributed upward. And that this is something that when it's happened before, during the 1920s and during what they called the Gilded Age in the late 19th century, it produced a political dynamic of reaction against this concentration, and it pushed the country in a more progressive or reformist direction. And I speculate that something like that, we're not exactly sure what, but something like that will probably be developing during the 1990s.
It's interesting when you, particularly if we talk about 1929 or leading up to, not only did it have a political consequence, it also had an economic consequence. Did the crash of 1929, did the Depression years that followed after the crash of 1929 have anything to do in a cyclical way with the fact that we did experience a depression? Is there any connection in the business cycle or understanding the wide swings of the business cycle, such as we have seen perhaps in a 60-year cycle or something back to then?
Well, there's something.
Could we look forward to a depression, or no, to a recession, a deepened recession, or even on into a depression, as Ravi Vatra has warned us of, and some others?
Well, I certainly don't predict that. There's some correlation that these boom cycles that come in late stages of Republican eras produce not just a concentration of wealth, but a lot of speculation and a growth of debt that creates an instability in the economy, and that therefore they are linked to patterns of pretty substantial adjustment. But I'm not certain that the 1990s have to produce something that's in any way analogous to the 1893 to 1929. It may well be that instead of a big bang, we'll have some little bangs, like the SNL's crisis was clearly a little bang. Maybe it's a mid-sized
pretty big bang.
Yeah.
I mean, it was getting...
But in terms of a big disruption of the economy, it's not like anything in the magnitude of 1929. Maybe we'll have something in real estate. Maybe LBOs and junk bonds still have to produce a problem. So what we have to hope, I think, is we have a bunch of little bangs and not a big bang. If we have a big bang, we can have a pretty substantial change, I think, in the culture and politics.
Well, we certainly could. Or we could even have, as you suggest in your book, little bangs, such as you say, could have a profound effect upon the politics of the immediate era, particularly 1992.
Yes, I mean, if the economy comes unravel in the next year, then you have to start taking seriously the possibility that George Bush might lose. Republican presidents lose if there's a weak economy, not otherwise. So the economy is the key to George Bush.
Yeah, it has been. The fact that you took these, you were giving this prognostication as were the emerging Republican majority at a time when it was not particularly seen by many in terms of the conventional wisdom. That is, you were in a certain sense a pioneer. Do you feel in a sense a pioneer in terms of what you're doing with this new book and the effect that the new book is having in terms of rethinking the political future of the society? Is it causing people to think perhaps in a different way than they have been in your experience? Now the book's only just out.
My sense is, yes, that it has emerged as a catalyst for a number of new ideas and interpretations. Certainly a number of the prominent Democrats are saying that. Former President Richard Nixon gave me a quote on the book jacket that he said that he thought this book would revolutionize the way we thought about politics in the 1990s, just the way the emerging Republican majority revolutionized it 20 years ago.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that there would be a tendency for there to be populist issues beginning to emerge in a way that perhaps they haven't been throughout the 80s or as widely seen? And will that change the likely candidate or the list of candidates that we might be able to see? Maybe some candidates could emerge that we can't see now given the situation that we find ourselves in?
Well, it may be that some candidates are going to emerge we don't see now. It's possible. I think what's more important is what happens to the economy that could affect the plausibility of some of the candidates who are out there. But it wouldn't surprise me if you didn't get a significant political effect out of these issues until 1996, because if the administration can just muddle through, they'll probably get George Bush back in.
Yeah. Is it your sense that we well might? You warn of a lot of these things that might develop, we might be able to have in our thinking. Is it your sense that things are likely to muddle through, as you put it, that things are we're not going to see enough of a major change, some of those of which you predict? You list 10 aspects in terms of some of these changes that you highlight in the book, all of which would spell a considerably different political climate in 1992 than what we see now. Are those prognostications? Are those things that you feel intuitively are likely to develop, or things that might? Or I just wonder, what is your gut feeling, as it were, intuitive feeling of what we're likely to confront as we come up to the election?
Well, my 10 factors are not necessarily things you can project. In other words, I talk about the 10 factors would include Republican presidents in the White House, an anti-government sense, a pro-business sense, tough times for labor, a lot of restructuring of the economy, tax cuts, disinflation, a two-tier economy nationally, concentration of wealth, and a lot of debt and speculation. Now, my sense is that you're going to see a change in the 1990s that reduces a number of those things. But exactly how much of a reversal you see, how much it goes in new directions, I'm not sure. You could even argue that if the Republicans were lucky and the Democrats were weak, that the Republicans could stay in power by changing policies. And I think in some respects George Bush is trying to do exactly that. I don't think he can do enough, but you never know.
You think the domestic issues, I mean, given the incredible changes in Eastern Europe and so forth over these last few years, the election is likely to turn on domestic economic issues?
Oh, my sense is that Americans vote on domestic issues unless there's a war.
Yeah, and so
other things tend to matter a lot less.
The title of your book bespeaks, and you also said in the speech you gave this morning to Ben's, is that that there's a tendency on the part of Republicans not to want to talk about the concentration of wealth. You gave one figure. The concentration of wealth has become very marked, I mean, over those periods of time. I know we had read a book, Robbie Bakra said that something on the order of close to 35 to 40% of all of our non-residential assets are owned by the upper 1%. There's been a concentration from the the immediate past. You've researched that carefully, the degree to which the capital assets are held by the upper 1 to 5% of our population. And is it significant that Americans and as citizens think about that fact and think about what the implications of that concentration of ownership are?
Well, as a matter of fact, I don't believe that there's any good current data on the concentration of assets. You have to go back to 1983. The Federal Reserve did a study back then, or they did it for the year 1983. And right at the moment, we're working with outdated data. My sense is if you did have a good survey of where the assets were concentrated for 1988 or 89, you would show a significant change from 1983, that there'd be more concentration in the hands of the top 1%.
Yeah.
But we don't have the number, and we don't know what it is.
Yeah.
And my sense is that people are only going to get interested and aggravated over these things in a slow way, and a lot will probably depend on what happens to the economy. If all of a sudden the economy starts going into the tank, and people get the sense that, hey, a lot of this had to do with the S&Ls, with the extent to which they're paralyzing fiscal policy in Washington, or they're running up interest rates, or any number of explanations. All of those things can make people more concerned about who got money and more angry.
Yeah, more angry, particularly SNL. It's already beginning to stir things up at the grassroots level and other places because it's a thing that's stirring things up. And then there are also some disquieting signs here as we talk in late July, early August of 1990 of a slowdown in the economy and that sort of thing. There are regional areas of recession in the Northeast and so forth, so that there is disquietude among the general society about the state of the health. And of course, as you say, these are the major issues upon which the elections are decided.
Well, there's certainly no doubt that people are getting more nervous about the economy, especially on the East Coast and down in the Sun Belt. The Midwest is still the most optimistic. What happens to the economy will be enormously important. There's just no substitute for that as a force in the minds of people to make them frustrated with a Republican president. Democrats can be very vulnerable on a much larger group of issues. But when Republicans stumble, it's almost always over the economy.
Yeah, those economic and bread and butter issues almost always have a major effect in terms of affecting these national elections. I've mentioned it again. You were here in New York. Welcome you to New York and so forth, giving a talk, and you've given some thoughts to the Benz. The people here gathered at Benz. We have some of that tape now that we could share with some of the audience, some of your thoughts that you had in that speech, and perhaps we could run a little piece of that tape now and let people get a sense of some of the things that you said to the people at the Benz meeting, and then we could come back and round this up, if that's all right. And so in the audience, then we could present you again, talking with Kevin Phillips, of course, here, and we're going to present now some of his remarks that he gave to the Business Executives for National Security meeting here in New York on July 30, 1990 in New York City. So if we could run that tape now, then please, and we'll come back at the conclusion of it. Thank you very much. Please run the tape now.
Now we're starting to get increasingly the sense that what matters to the public is the undeclared international economic conflict as it were. The polls all show people more concerned about the Japanese as a commercial, financial, and economic threat than about Russia as a military threat. So all of this represents a change in the international context of U.S. politics. Then you take the economy, issues the Republicans have been dominating in the last 10 years, and not as much in the earlier portion, but they have in the last 10 years. I think the administration is in the process of losing the tax issue for the Republicans. The question as to whether inflation is making a comeback hasn't been answered, but there's some concern about that. The SNL issue, every poll I've seen suggests is more of a problem for the Republicans, simply because Americans tend to look to the executive branch and blame it, not the legislative branch. When it comes to legislative involvement in the SNL scandal, the Democrats win that squeeze war hands down. But the larger blame, I think, will probably go to the executive branch, and that's Republican. The question of wealth concentration as an issue is another economic weakness of the Republicans. Turning into the domestic set of issues, the environment is one that clearly favors the Democrats, and it raises communal yardsticks as opposed to economic individualism, moves against thrust of the 80s. The question of abortion, another issue which, in my opinion, tends to favor the Democrats. There's extreme situations in which the Democrats' mismanagement of that issue takes over, and the Republicans play brilliantly, but basically I think it divides the Republican coalition. The family issues emerging, sort of the same thing. Family leave, daycare, so forth. And then lastly, the question of religion in politics. That was a very major cutting edge for Republican presidential nominees in 1972. Then Carter interrupted that, but then it came back with Reagan, and Bush benefited very considerably in 1988. But at this point, we're starting to see, I think, less effectiveness of the religious right. You turn on the evening news, it's now that your big-time preacher has trouble with his sexual identity, or he's being indicted. Isn't exactly the key to success. So I have the sense that in a larger framework, a lot of these issues, which were the dynamics of the early stage of the Republican coalition, are in a fading process. Now, the fact that they're fading, the Republicans still at this point win hands down over the Democrats on being the party best equipped to protect national security or to keep the country prosperous, manage the economy. They win these management-type questions. They're the party that people associate with running the White House. The Democrats are these people who you're not certain quite what you associate them with, but it's not winning and it's not management. There's a joke on the Republican side that the Democratic presidential candidates of the last 20 years can be easily summed up in a sort of profile sense. The country has Mount Rushmore. The Democrats have Mount Rushmore right up there in the stone. You've got George McGovern, Jimmy Carter, Walter Mondale, and Michael Dukakis. Now that's 4 deuces in anybody's strategic card game, let me tell you. Now, does this mean that the Democrats are incapable of presenting a profile in the 1990s to take advantage of some of the trends that are developing? Yes and no. I mean, in a sense it does, because it's not an overwhelming group of people. But if there's one thing that's clear from reading American history is that when history calls, it doesn't always anoint an overwhelming group of people. And if you want to get good proof of this, you can go back and look at the late 1960s. How many people in 1967 to 1968 would have thought that beginning in 1968 the Republicans were going to dominate the presidency for 20 of the next 24 years? Pardon me. If you were to go back and look at 1928 or 1929, how many people would have thought that the Democrats would dominate the presidency beginning in 1932 for 20 solid years? Well, virtually nobody would have thought that. So when history's getting ready to strike, when power's getting ready to pass, it doesn't necessarily give you a lot of advance notice. And it doesn't necessarily require any great abilities on the part of the people who are about to receive the burden, so to speak. I was asked to go out to a retreat the Democratic senators had 2 weeks ago, and I talked to them about the book, and I did. And I said some of the best news in this for you all is that power has gone before the people who are in no sense thought ready to receive it by the American public. I sort of didn't smile as much as maybe they might have. The historical lesson is really quite true there. When the tide is ready to turn, it will often go to people whose readiness for it doesn't overwhelm you. Now, if I can turn to the political economy, what to me are interesting ingredients of the 1980s that we haven't seen before I get into the question of defense expenditures and their relationship to this larger economy. Historically, the role of the Republican Party has been to come in when inflation was a problem and crack down on inflation and bring it under control. And the Democrats, by contrast, would win the White House away from the Republicans when the economy was weak, and that would give them the chance to stimulate, and then they would stimulate, they created inflation, and that was how things sort of fed on each other. But during the 1980s, what we have seen is an unprecedentedly long business recovery pattern, a very long economic cycle, which is already giving rise to the question as to whether we still have a business cycle. Now, as I say, for the Republicans, it's a quite unusual phenomenon because they tended to run shorter cycles, and we got used to, in the Republican Party, the notion of having a recession in time for every midterm election, which did seem to happen with a depressing regularity. Now, what happened during the 1980s was a little bit different. Ronald Reagan was a very unique American president. Now, one of the unique factors in Reagan's presidency is here's a man who cast his first 4 votes for president for Franklin D. Roosevelt. He gets to the White House and he puts up a picture of Calvin Coolidge. Now, what this suggests is you've got an interesting combination here with this. You've got a wire somewhere that should have gone to a B terminal that went to an A terminal. And this is what we had during the 1980s in terms of economic policy.
Back again now with Kevin Phillips, and it's an interesting number of things. The issues that you go into and the issues that are raised in the speech are the issues that are going to be confronting the economy over this considerable period of time. The issues of the concentration, well, back again to it, and again taking a theme from your book, the politics of the rich and the poor. Do the issues of that, do you feel the issues of the rich and the poor, or the fact that there are, even though we've had such a long period of business expansion and so forth in this economy, that we seem to have in so many parts of the country numbers of people that has not trickled down to, as it were, to. We talk often of homelessness and other kinds of people. There are evidences of numbers of children that live in poverty now. It's emerging in other questions. Is that an endemic problem, do you think, or is it one that we can address? It's hard to think in terms of a business expansion that's gone so long, general prosperity, but seems not to have trickled down? Does it call into question any basic assumptions or the need perhaps for distribution of ownership or some ways of distributing wealth to the greater numbers of people that have not been reached domestically and perhaps internationally? Does it mean that we need to have some sort of a way perhaps of directing our attention to the underclass, an overworked term, or the poor peoples of the world, as it were, more effectively, perhaps the first world, more effectively than we have? A broad general question. But
well, I'm not
what
sure.
does it say about the state of the capitalist free market world, as it were?
I wouldn't like to reach any broad conclusions about the state of the capitalist free world from all this. What I'd say is that I think it's becoming generally agreed to perception in many of the major countries that we do need to be more concerned about those who were left out of this prosperity during the 1980s. And there's a growing sense that those were fairly large numbers. But as far as whether it calls into question the fundamental capitalist ethic, I don't think so, because the capitalist ethic is in many ways a pretty well understood ethic, and you unleash it and it achieves a lot, but it can get too greedy pretty quickly. And that anybody who says that capitalist or conservative economic ethic is good forever is overstating it. It has to be sort of taken out of action every once in a while, and it has to be replaced by something that's a little more socially, I hate to say aware because it's such a ridiculous word, but a little bit more socially conscious. Mm-hmm. But the notion that this calls for a great reevaluation of capitalism, I don't think so. I think it just calls for more historical understanding that any of these ideologies have a limitation. You can't let them go too far.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking of Mr. Francis Fukuyama's reading of The End of History and the end of a socialist critique of the basic liberal philosophy of the West, and thinking in a broad general tableau whether or not the systems and institutions we have are sufficient to lead us and to guide us, or if we need new thinking. Do you think there's anything to be said for the general proposition that we might begin to think of expanding ownership of capital assets, such as Louis Kelso and Russell Long have been trying to do with their employee stock ownership plans and so forth? Or I don't know if you'd want to comment on that.
No, I think that the ESOP, employee stock ownership plan, is something that's been growing, and it's been growing partly because it does give more and more people a chance to get into the ownership process, and in many cases to the decision-making process. So to the extent those two go together, I think it tends to broaden the base of capitalism and is a useful thing.
It is a useful thing because it broadens also and underpins, as it were, the institution of private property, rather than necessarily having to go to a taxation policy or through a more government intervention into the marketplace. Just one last word. I know you're running. You got to catch you got a busy schedule and so forth. What's your general sense about things as far as the national economy and the national prospect? There are people looking. We have major changes in Europe, major changes that have occurred over this last period of time as far as Eastern Europe, Soviet Union, just on a world scale. What's your general assessment about the prospects for our nation, economically, morally, socially, and so forth? Are you generally optimistic or pessimistic, or do you see more challenge or more opportunity as you look ahead as far as the broad brush sense of the prospect for the American state of the nation is concerned?
Well, my sense is that historically, when America's come to one of these needs to sort of revitalize and refocus itself, we've been able to do that, and the political system has lent itself to a small-scale upheaval, not a revolution like they might have in Europe, but a political watershed in the United States. I think something like that is necessary again during the 1990s, and the question is whether Americans can now do that sort of thing again. A lot of people are doubtful about it. I tend to think that probably we can manage to do it again, and I think in certain ways that constitutes a reasonable amount of optimism, because I think if the United States does get itself reharnessed and gets back on the road, that once again there's a lot of opportunity out there. But I think we've got to repackage our politics. It's got to have a broader outlook, and we've got to hope that the people can force the politicians to deal with things the politicians so far haven't been able to deal with. Mm-hmm. The fact that I think maybe we can probably adds up to a relatively optimistic viewpoint.
Yeah, well, let's hope that we can. It would seem to me, if I may say so, that you've been on the cutting edge of predicting and foreseeing changes that are coming into the future, and one might hope that the prescriptions you have or the analysis you have of the American situation might be one that we could all repair to, and I certainly think the book is one that can be recommended to be read by one and all. And I want to thank you very much for it, and for your address today, and particularly for participating here in this cable television interview here in New York City. It's been your pleasure to have the perceptions and some of the remarks of Kevin Phillips. Happy to have been able to bring you his perceptions, and we invite you to stay tuned. There'll be more coming up in the same general topic area momentarily. That's it for this particular segment. Kevin Phillips, once again, thank you very, very much for coming in. It's been a great pleasure talking with you. Stay tuned. We're coming right back. The upcoming interview with Dr. Benjamin Friedman of Harvard University discussing his book, The Day of Reckoning, was originally videotaped on May 3rd, 1989. It's Dr. Benjamin Friedman. Thank you. Welcome very, very much to Conversations, where I'm very pleased this evening to welcome to the program, on this segment of the program, Dr. Benjamin Friedman. And Dr. Friedman is an economist with the Harvard University and has written an extremely interesting book, one that's captured the attention of many of the responsible people in American world society, called The Day of Reckoning. And Benjamin Friedman, welcome very, very much to Conversation.
Thank you very much.
I wonder if you might, the issue of the deficit and some of the problems that confront the American economy is something that all responsible people are really interested in. I wonder if we might be able to begin, since the subtitle of your book has to do with the consequences of Mr. Reagan's economic policy and so forth, the idea of the supply-side argumentation, the Laffer curve, the idea that if we cut taxes and so forth, we would have an increase in revenue. What is your general assessment of the efficacy of the underpinnings, the theoretical underpinnings of supply-side philosophy that was ushered in with Mr. Reagan? And what have been the effects of that, if you could, please?
I don't think there's anything wrong with the theory or the philosophy. I think everybody knows, every economist knows, that under some circumstances it could be that we could reduce tax rates, and that reduction would so stimulate people to work more and save more and invest more that the government might actually collect not less but more revenues as a result.
And were our taxes at too high a rate?
And the answer is no. The issue is not could that happen at some conceivable set of circumstances. Yes, of course it could happen. The real issue is whether the United States, as of 1980, had a tax structure and an economic circumstance that plausibly corresponded to the conditions that would have been necessary in order for that to work out. And the answer is simply no. We did not. And therefore, when we cut tax rates substantially across the board, that did in turn lead to a substantial reduction in government revenue from what revenue otherwise would have been. And then, because we were told that we would have this revenue coming in, the president had not prepared people, nor I think had he prepared himself, for the need to cut government spending. So the real problem is that we cut government revenues, but we didn't and were never willing to cut government spending. And as a result, we've had the enormous deficit that's been absorbing our saving and preventing us from investing in business machinery and plant ever since.
And contributes to many of the problems that confront the United States economy.
I believe that's right. I think the basic fact is that the federal government's deficit to cover this shortfall of revenue that you mentioned from what we've spending has been absorbing about 3/4 of all that American families and American businesses combined have been saving. And then that saving that then isn't available to go into business research and machinery and equipment and new plants, and without all that investment, our business isn't able to be productive and competitive. We aren't able to pay higher wages to workers. And I think, as you say, many of our economic problems today, not all, but many, have stemmed from the need to suck in so much of our saving just to finance the government's fiscal imbalance.
Yeah, and the problems are such, and we do want to talk about them, and I don't mean to have a history lesson here, but I wonder if maybe you could go back as an economist and say the difference between the tax cut that President Kennedy enacted under Mr. Heller advice and so forth in 1963, was the philosophy the same, the situation the same, was the resultant the same of the tax cut in 1963, and what were the differences?
I don't know that much specifically about the tax cut of 1963, except that in 1963 we had a relatively underemployed economy, and as the economy moved upward to full employment, taxes were gradually increased. There was, after all, in 1968 a tax surcharge, and meanwhile at that time we were having inflation, and because the tax brackets were not indexed for inflation, as we had inflation, there was in effect a tax increase, even though Congress didn't have to vote it. The 1980s have been very different. In the 1980s, we cut taxes in 1981 and 82 and 83, and because we had an underemployed economy at that time, after all, 81, 82 was the worst recession in 50 years, that wasn't so bad. The real problem is that since 1985, the economy has been back at full employment. We haven't needed that government deficit for anything. Now, even with some inflation, it doesn't matter because the tax brackets are indexed against inflation. And therefore, as the economy has moved back to full employment, we still have this pressing government deficit which continues to absorb our saving. So I think that's the main difference I'd emphasize between what happened in the 60s and what's happened today. After all, the tax cut that you mentioned was enacted in 1964, but by 1969 we had a government surplus 5 years later. This tax cut was enacted in 1981. Here we are today, 8 years later, and the government's deficit is still absorbing close to $200 billion of our savings.
Staggering. And that was against the backdrop of the war on poverty and against the backdrop of the Vietnam War.
Yes, that's right. Of course, the surplus that we achieved in 1969 was after the war effort had wound down somewhat. But still, it's the case that 5 years after that tax cut, by reversing it with a tax surcharge and by allowing inflation to take its course, we had gotten back to a surplus in our government accounts, whereas today we're nowhere near a surplus. Indeed, today anybody who thinks the government is really going to have less than $100 billion deficit, as they claim, is, I think, a wild optimist.
Yeah, it's really hard to know. Against that, in a sense, negative view of things, and of course there's a great number of reasons to be that, many in the society would look at the performance, as it were, over the last 8 years or so and say, well, we've got unemployment down, we have a long business expansion that has been relatively reasonable interest rates relative to the 70s and so forth. So if there was, how do we weigh those signs of success, as it were, in the American economy against the problems that the deficit and foreign trade deficit also do present?
Well, first place, to give credit where credit is due, I think there is one outstanding economic success of the Reagan years. That is reducing inflation. Now, everybody knows that it was the Federal Reserve under Paul Volcker that carried out the policy directly that got inflation under control. But I think we do have to give Mr. Reagan substantial credit, in the first place, for paving the way, for campaigning in his election campaign on the basis that inflation really did have to come down, and second, for supporting the Volcker policy. Mr. Reagan was given many opportunities either to criticize the Volcker policy publicly or to dissociate himself from it, and to his credit, he never did that. Some of the people who worked for him did, but the president himself never did it, and so I think he gets some substantial amount of credit for reducing inflation. Now, on the side of how well we're doing other than having reduced inflation, I think we don't have a prosperity today. We have the illusion of prosperity. During the most recent election campaign, for example, George Bush repeatedly emphasized, and he was right, that this is the longest running business expansion in U.S. peacetime history. That's all true.
Positive fact. Or positive.
But what nobody pointed out was that this is the first business expansion in 50 years in the United States in which the average American is seeing his or her wage lose ground compared to inflation.
Now, how can we account for that?
I think the reason why that's true is that we have been absorbing so much of our saving into funding the government deficit that in the 1980s, instead of spending more than we used to on business investment in new machinery, new plant, new equipment, we're spending less. And therefore business isn't being productive and competitive, and when they're not productive and competitive, business can't afford to pay high wages. So the average American is losing ground. The average American in 1983, when this expansion began, was earning more than he is today in 1983 dollars.
A fact, a statistical fact. I mean, how we come at the average, some people have benefited mightily by this.
Some people have done...
Other people have suffered.
But that's always going to be the case. After all, it's the way a capitalist free enterprise economy works and should work is always that some people do well and other people do less well. I think that's healthy. But what's happened in the 1980s for the first time is that on average, in a time that's supposed to be prosperity, people are losing ground. That's not very healthy.
No, it's not very healthy at all. And so much of the capital has gone into things that, I mean, that which has been able to be garnered for investment purposes or for utilization of the economy, so much of it has been now, mergers and takeovers and things in play and paper manipulation rather than in good firm investment in plant and equipment.
Yes, although that doesn't absorb saving, because if one firm uses its retained earnings, its saving, or if it borrows your saving and mine, in order to buy a second firm, what it's doing is paying the shareholders of the firm that it's buying. And so that simply transfers saving from us to some people who used to be the shareholders of the acquired firm. So that doesn't absorb saving. I think there are lots of dangers associated with the use of debt and the takeover movement in our economy. I'm glad to see it appears now, as of May of '89, it appears to be slowing somewhat, and I'm glad for that. So I have not been a fan of the takeover move, but I think one criticism we can't really level against it is to say that it's absorbed saving. I don't think it's done that.
Well, that's interesting. Have the business decisions or the decisions and the kind of investments that have been made then been such that are well taken investments in plant and equipment that is helping?
We don't. I think it's too early to know. What we do know is that there hasn't been much plant and equipment built. That's what we know. We know already, we have good information about how much of that activity has taken place. And the thrust of your question is right on the mark, because what matters is not just how much, but did you do the right kind, and did you put it in the right place, and can you manage it effectively? And those questions we'll find out as time goes on. But for right now, what we know is that we didn't do very much. And in particular, compared to the scale of our economy, we're now doing less than we did in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s.
We said before the sociological implications of the fiscal policies was a transfer of wealth. People use these terms simplistically, perhaps. There was a tendency of a transfer of wealth from the middle and lower sections of our society toward the upper classes in our society, and the more wealthy and well-to-do investment community in our society. Has there been a transfer, a shift of overall wealth to those that are a concentration of wealth and ownership of the means of production in our society over the 8 years as a result?
Yes, there clearly has. The distribution of income and of wealth has clearly become more unequal. There's lots of evidence of that. I'm not convinced that that's directly attributable to our fiscal policies, however. Exactly why it's taken place, I'm not sure. I think it has in part to do with our fiscal policy, because after all, if we're talking about the average American's wages going down rather than up compared to inflation, and we remember that for the great bulk of the population, wage income is about the only income they get.
Almost 95% of the population really have no effective ownership, I think, on an individual basis.
Pretty much so, although many participate through pensions and the like. But still, there's a large part of the population whose sole income source is labor wage income. And so right away, when you talk about the fact that wages are going down compared to inflation, that has to tell you something about how about half of the people are doing. I think the biggest increases in inequality have probably come about through this wave of speculation and paper asset swaps that you were talking about a minute ago, and whether I think that bears only a more tenuous connection to the fiscal policy that we've had.
Were there political implications to that? The breaking of the PAVCO strike, the anti-union stance of many people within the administration, and the general many labor unions bargaining down and so forth relative to the their position. So that this has not been a happy time, in a certain sense, for organized labor or for those who represent the interests of organized labor.
Yes, that's certainly true.
Is there a political component to
Yes, I'm sure there is. Remember, though, that outside the government part of our economy, looking only at the private sector, we're now down to only 1 worker in 8 belongs to a labor union.
Is that in part the cause for some of the, in your view, I wonder, is that part of the problem why the share of labor or the share of the income going to labor is that they're not effectively organized as well as they might?
No, I don't think so.
Now that unemployment is at a lower rate, might we see a change in that, or how can we see a redress in the situation of laboring people being relatively disadvantaged through the traditional collective bargaining process and so forth, or what?
It's possible that that's true, but I think that the more fundamental cause for the inability to have real wages grow during the 80s has not been the failure of the unions, but rather the fact that business has not invested, has not achieved productivity growth, and therefore simply has not been able to pay wages. Historically, while we can have wage growth without productivity growth or vice versa for a year or 2 or 3 at a time, historically it's always been true that the basis on which business has been able to pay higher wages has been growth in productivity. And when productivity stagnates, sooner or later real wages are going to stagnate also. I think that's what's happening here. And the union phenomenon may be important in some places, but looking across the society as a whole, I don't think so.
Yeah, we're here talking with you, having given a speech for which I thank you very much in the name of the Business Executives for National Security, an organization of people concerned with national security issues and the relationship of the guns and butter issues and so forth in terms of our economy. During the Reagan years, there was a tremendous defense buildup and so forth. What's the net effect of the concentration upon a military buildup as opposed to a concern with domestic interests, perhaps seen that way, in terms of this maldistribution, perhaps in terms of the income going to the American people? What's the effect of the fact that we have been on a course of military expansion and not expansion, but a military buildup in our economy relative to a longer historical trend?
I don't know. That's an interesting question. To the extent that our military buildup has consisted of building hardware, then I think there is some reason to believe that primarily creates jobs in the manufacturing sector for the more skilled part of the labor force. And you could say that to some extent that has helped to increase inequality. By contrast, to the extent that what we've done is added troop strength and built compensation levels for troops, this is now providing opportunities for the people from the other end of the income distribution, and so I think that goes in the other direction.
So it's a little bit hard to, you can't measure the economic effects of military-oriented buildup of the economy. It's
not just at the level of military alone. You have to separate into hardware versus personnel versus other things, and I simply haven't seen that done.
There's some people, we did an interview with Mr. Melman, Seymour Melman, who was interested in conversion. Ted Weiss has a bill now that would try and direct us toward less military spending, more domestic-oriented spending.
Well, I think that's happening already.
Have that happen. Perhaps in one hopes not too sanguine a view of Mr. Gorbachev's initiative towards perhaps seeing a less prone world and so forth, but that we might be able to move toward a less military-oriented economy. I wonder if you have any comment on that.
Well, certainly if the world security situation changes from one view of the threats and challenges that we face to another one, that might have a profound effect on our national security. But I think it's important to understand
and those in terms would have an effect on the economy.
Yes, it would. But I think it's important to understand that this movement away from the military buildup is happening already. In brief, what happened is that by the end of the Nixon years, the Nixon-Ford period, we were spending about 5% of our total national income on defense.
Almost 7.
And that stayed pretty steady through the Carter years, started to increase a little bit at the end of the Carter administration. But then under Mr. Reagan, what had been 5% very rapidly crossed over to become almost 6.5% of our income. But now it's going back the other way because the Reagan military buildup compared to national income topped out several years ago. And in the latter part of Mr. Reagan's years, the Congress enforced pretty tight control over military spending in the aggregate, and that's now continuing. And you see in the first Bush budget there is the proposal for 1 year of zero real growth in military spending, and next year, even if Congress lets him have it, would be 1% real growth. And as long as the economy is continuing to grow along at a couple of percent per annum, that means that the military spending is now shrinking compared to our national income. So we're not anywhere near going back down to the 5% level where we were at the end of the Nixon-Ford years, beginning of the Carter years, but we're receding already from where we were in, say, 1985-86 when the Reagan buildup topped out.
Yeah. We have this deficit, back again to that question and so forth. I wonder, do you have, in May 1989, prescriptions in terms of what we might consider collectively as a society and our political business leadership might consider as courses that are prudent for us, particularly with a longer-term view of the responsibility we have to future generations and so forth?
I do, yes.
Yeah.
I think we need to do three things. First, I think we have to have genuine cuts, emphasis on the genuine, as opposed to accounting gimmicks, genuine cuts in government spending. I think it is simply wrong to claim, as many people do, that there are no available places in which we can cut spending. The Congressional Budget Office, for example, has outlined over 100 different options for cutting government spending, ranging from defense to entitlements to farm programs to general non-defense spending. I think across the board we can and we should have genuine cuts in government spending. But second, because I don't think that we either can or will want to cut government spending by enough to redress the imbalance, I think we will also need to have a tax increase. And my sense of this is that if we did half of what we need on the spending side and the other half on the revenue side, that would be about right. And then finally, as a third matter, I think we need an easier monetary policy, lower interest rates, because after all, if we have a fiscal retrenchment of the order of what we need, and we do that and nothing else, there is the risk of putting the economy into a recession that nobody wants and nobody needs. But if instead we accompany that fiscal retrenchment with an easing of monetary policy so that we have approximately the same overall amount of stimulus from monetary policy, but it comes less from the fiscal side, more from the monetary side, I think then we'd have approximately the same overall growth in the economy as before, but it would be less in consumer spending, more in investment, which would be good, and we'd have less imports and more exports, which would also be good.
What form of taxation would you think would be the most appropriate?
I, like many economists, would favor a value-added tax, which is what the Europeans have. I think that would be not just a way of raising revenue, but also would enhance our competitiveness with foreign countries. An advantage of the value-added tax is that items made for export are exempted from value-added taxation, and also business investment is exempted from taxation. So I would favor a value-added tax. If we had a 4% national sales tax, which is like a value-added tax, and we exempted all purchases of food, clothing, shelter, and medical care in order to avoid this tax being unfair for low-income families, that would raise something between $50 and $60 billion a year, which would be the right order of magnitude for thinking we've solved half of the problem.
Do you think there's any possibility of a wealth that would be directed toward a wealth tax? There are some people talking of that. There are constitutional problems, but a tax on accumulations of wealth?
Yeah, I haven't even heard that mentioned, and I have no idea what the constitutional problems are.
That's
a
not
wealth,
talking.
A
tax oriented at those who have a net worth over, at those at the top end, as it were, of the economy.
It's very
Ravi Batra, who has written on the prospect not only of a recession but perhaps a depression that he wrote. He had a popular best-selling book, The Depression of 1990. Some people feel we might be approaching not only a recession but a depression. I think October, a couple of years back, frightened a number of people by the uncertainty or the inability to understand how such a thing would happen. You mentioned before the possibility we want to avoid a recession, slowdown. Do you think there's any possibility of our moving towards something that's worse than a recession?
Oh, I see. There's always
chance of that.
There's always a possibility, but I certainly see no sound basis on the basis of which one would predict that that's going to happen.
Were you surprised by the turn down in the 500-point drop and so forth yourself as you were viewing things by many?
Oh, yes, of course.
Yeah.
I know of no one who wasn't. So, yes, of course, I was surprised. I was not surprised that that did not lead to 1933 all over again. And the reason is twofold. One, our economy has a very different structure now than it did in 1983. The aspects of economic activity that are very cyclically volatile are simply smaller as a share of our economic activity today than they were then, and conversely the aspects of economic activity like the services spending, the government sector that keep on going play a much greater role in our economy now than they did then. But secondly, I think it's inconceivable now that the Federal Reserve would react in the way it did then, permitting the collapse of the banking system that we had then. Because after all, the stock market collapsed in 1929, but it wasn't until after the banking system collapsed, first abroad and then here, and we had this ineffective monetary policy that we eventually developed the recession of 1931 and 32. If the stock market had, or to put it another way, in the first year, even the first 14 months after the stock market collapsed, say from October of 1929 until December of 1930, there was absolutely nothing that would have led anybody to think that we were going to have the experience of 31 and 32.
Yes.
But then starting in December of 1930, we had the bank system start to collapse, and that was the stage at which we then did have what I think is appropriately called the Great Depression.
Yes, right.
What with our deposit insurance system today, the fact that the government stands behind not just the insured deposits, but as I think we're now seeing in the savings and loan crisis, the government stands behind all of the deposits. I think it's very difficult to imagine that the conditions that led to the Great Depression in the 30s would repeat themselves now.
Well, one and all would hope that you're correct to that.
I certainly do.
Obviously, one and all. We're running short on time, and I know you have a busy schedule and so forth, but I just wonder, the idea of the problems of the deficit, the problems of this, and some of the prescriptions of which might be evolved, are you, maybe in a brief kind of way, how you feel about Mr. Reagan's approach to it? Do you think that we have a political consensus, or enough of a political consensus for us collectively to carry out the things that we need to in order to address the problems of the deficit? Or
I think
what is your sense of what the likely actual policy directions are likely to be?
Well, I'm not a political pundit,
No,
but let me say what I do know. First, in traveling around the country and talking to people, my sense is that the American public is ready for some new policy course. And even on taxes, I believe that if people could be reassured that taxes would be accompanied by lower government spending, not higher taxes just to fuel higher government spending, I think the public would readily accept that. Second, on the basis of at least the people in Congress I talked to, I think our elected legislative representatives are also ready for a change. I think what we need now is leadership from the top, specifically from President Bush. And there, I've been very impressed in the first 4 months of his administration with the extent to which, without making a lot of to-do about it, he has been willing to reverse course from what Mr. Reagan was doing. I think the savings and loan problem, which we mentioned a second ago, is a good example. I think the third world debt crisis is a good example again. We've gone from the Baker plan under Mr. Reagan to the Brady plan, and even though I don't believe the Brady plan will be enough in quantitative terms, I think the whole philosophical change from the way we approached developing country debt problems under the Baker plan, that is always pretending that everything was going to be okay, treating each of these times that a country couldn't meet its obligations as idiosyncratic, to the new approach under the Brady plan, which for the first time officially recognizes that there is a systemic problem. I think that's a philosophical sea change of great importance. And in the context in which Mr. Bush has been willing to take these steps, which really are breaks with Reagan policy, I'm prepared to be optimistic that he might provide us with the presidential leadership that we need, and that if he does so, we're likely to make some progress. I certainly hope so.
Yeah, well, one and all would hope that we find the leadership that we need in order to get away from the obvious problems that have arisen from this the problems that arise from this incredible deficit. And if I may say so, your book deals with these issues perhaps as lucidly as any other out in the society. I want to congratulate you very much on all your work.
Thank you, I appreciate it.
And on the book, and I certainly want to thank you very much for participating here in this segment of conversation.
Thank you for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Not at all. I've enjoyed it, and welcome to New York. And I would remind you in the cable audience, it's been your pleasure to have the perceptions. And again, Benjamin Friedman, Harvard University, and author of this incredibly relevant book, Day of Reckoning, and happy to be able to bring you his perceptions.
Myself, go on. You